But I want to welcome everyone. I'm Sion Winship. I'm on the board of the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design. And I am so excited to host this, one of our first events. We have, as of right now, 100 participants joining us. And since I was the one who sent out all of the confirmations, I happen to know that we have people joining us from all over the world, be it Australia, from the UK, from Germany. So wherever you are, whether you're having a nice cocktail to celebrate the end of the weekend or you're having morning coffee, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. I wanted to begin by telling you a little bit about the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design. We're actually an organization that's been around a long, long time. We are a nonprofit organization that was started by the architect himself, Richard J. Neutra, in 1962. And our mission is to preserve the Neutra legacy and to promote creative research and design that benefits people and the planet. So those who are familiar with Richard J. Neutra's work mostly know him for his custom homes, for his single-family residences, if you will. And so today's event is here to do a little bit of myth busting, frankly. So we'll be talking a little bit about the history of multi-unit housing. We'll talk about Neutra's projects in that area, and also what we can learn about multi-unit housing and how that can be applied to contemporary design. And to that end, we have three presenters who are exceptionally well suited to taking on each of those three areas. So I expect that we will learn a lot and have lively conversation. I also would very much like to thank our co-sponsors, the Friends of Residential Treasures, LA, or Fort Los Angeles, and Russell Brown. And I would like to just share a little bit about their organization. It's a nonprofit dedicated to inspiring pride in Los Angeles by empowering people to see our city in new ways through a tapestry of neighborhoods and homes and the stories that they tell. Fort's award-winning flagship Trails program releases a curated monthly themed architectural exploration route. And next month, part of the reason they co-hosted and co-sponsored this with us is they are going to do 2 trails that correspond to the theme of today's event. There will be a trail on Schindler's multifamily residential projects in Silver Lake, which is curated by author and journalist Andrew Romano, and Neutra's multi-household structures, curated by our very own Raymond Neutra. So I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, visit fortla.org, which is pretty easy to remember, and sign up, because that's how you will receive the trails and information about other exciting things that they do. So I'm quite sure we have a whole lot of people who are joining today who may not have ever done a Zoom program, but I want to tell you just a little bit about how we do these programs and what the run of show is and what your expectations should be. We are going to have 3 15-minute presentations from our 3 panelists. That will be followed by Q&A. So that having been said, that's really all the housekeeping we have to do. I would like to go ahead and introduce our panelists for today. And I'm going to talk about them in the order in which they will be presenting. Our first presenter is the esteemed Michael Webb. He grew up in London, worked there as a journalist, moved to the US in 1969, and now lives in Los Angeles. He's authored 30 books on architecture and design, most recently Architects' Houses, but also Building Community, New Apartment Architecture, which is of course relevant to our topic today, as well as a memoir, which I didn't know before I got his bio, called Moving Around, A Lifetime of Wandering. But Michael's a busy guy, and he also has edited and contributed essays to a score of monographs, and also to leading journals across the United States, Asia, and Europe. And because of all of his achievements, the LA chapter of the American Institute of Architects named him as an honorary member for his advocacy of excellence in building over the past 5 decades. Our second presenter today, who is presenting from the historic Neutra office building in Silver Lake, One of the 3 buildings that the stewardship is under the stewardship of the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design is Raymond Neutra. Dr. Neutra is the youngest son of architect Richard Neutra. After a public health career in environmental medicine and epidemiology at several universities in the California Department of Public Health, he's been drawn back to the legacy of his father and his brother, and he now serves as president of the Institute. He's also, though, in the last several years, the decades, really been active in the preservation of Neutra VDL studio, residences, and several other Neutra projects. And last, but absolutely not least, is Larry Scarpa, FAIA. Larry is an architect, a principal in the firm of Brooks Scarpa. He's also the recipient of the 2022 AIA Gold Medal for his work. He's received 200 design awards, and he's been teaching at USC and molding young minds since 2013. So we have, again, as you can see, quite the esteemed group of panelists, and we will go ahead and get the program started.
Thank you, Sian. A few years ago, I wrote Building Community, a new apartment architecture, and from that book, I selected for this presentation a dozen varied projects for people of modest means, students, and the homeless. Old and new, large and small, these projects all show how good design can enrich lives by achieving a balance of community, privacy, and openness. In contrast to conventional tower blocks and dingbats with their double-loaded corridors, most of these apartments enjoy cross-ventilation and abundant natural light. They also serve as social condensers where residents get to know their neighbors on rooftop terraces and staircases, in courtyards and meeting rooms. The crisis of homelessness and the critical shortage of affordable housing is growing ever worse in Los Angeles as in other American cities. It can be resolved only by an exponential increase in multi-unit housing. It cannot be left to the market. We need major investment by public agencies and nonprofits. Tragically, 3/4 of LA is zoned for single-family housing, which engenders a suburban mentality and the NIMBYism that opposes any change in the character and density of housing. In LA, there's a stigma attached to rental apartments, and they've received far less attention in the past from architects and the public than that sacred cow, the private house, wasteful, inflexible, and unaffordable as it often is. For 40 years, Richard Neutra pointed the way to a saner policy, and a new generation of architects has embraced the concept of collective living. For the past 44 years, I've had the good fortune to live in a model of excellence, Neutra's Strathmore Apartments, which step up a hillside in Westwood and enclose a densely planted courtyard. Mine is the topmost one that was home and workshop for Charles and Ray Eames in the 1940s. When they built their new house in Pacific Palisades, they announced that they had been inspired by apartment living. And when they moved, they each wrote to Richard Neutra to thank him for nurturing their lives and their work. They cherished their privacy. I value that too, as well as the sense of community. Half my neighbors are like family. Across the street from me, Lorcan O'Herlihy designed Village Lofts, an award-winning linear block of apartments that are split through the middle and step down to conduct a dialogue with the Neutra. Neighbors fought the developer to abandon the crass and entirely overwhelming design and work with a really talented architect who understood the grain of Los Angeles and the need to create buildings that were in harmony with their neighbors, yet provided the same amount of accommodation. And O'Herlihy did that, and it's now currently rented by students who hang out on the 3 roof terraces. In downtown LA, the Skid Row Housing Trust commissioned Michael Maltson to design the Star Apartments, a 100-unit complex for the homeless atop a single-story retail block. To expedite construction and lighten the load, he craned in prefabricated wood units, clad them with stucco, and stacked them on concrete columns above the roof deck, which provides a garden, social amenities, and even a running track. Flashback a century to Amsterdam, where Michel de Klerk designed 2 model housing projects for workers who had formerly lived in dank apartment tenements. The ship, named for its sharp prow, was criticized for its ornate brickwork by progressive architects and by city councillors who deplored the added expense. To which the architect responded, "These people have been denied beauty all their lives. They deserve something better." Though the apartments are tiny by contemporary standards, the ship is still a vibrant community that opens up to a central courtyard. A small museum recounts its history and is well worth a visit. Five of the Berlin housing estates constructed for workers in the 1920s have become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And one of the best is the 2,000-unit Horseshoe Estate, named for the central feature. It was designed by city planner Martin Wagner and architect Bruno Taut, who enriched the facades and interiors with bold colors. These were restored a decade ago, along with the landscaping, which is incredibly generous. It represents everything that Corbusier aspired to in his Vie radieuse, a real rus in urbis, where you feel that you're surrounded by greenery as you look out. And you can immerse yourself in the period and place by spending a couple of nights in the Taut House, a little gem that is rented out online and looks as it did in 1930. Everyone knows Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation.
I'm sorry, Michael, we're having problems making this advance.
It's stuck.
Oh, okay, all right.
Everyone knows Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, a first step toward the radiant city he dreamed of building. Split-section apartments command views of hills and sea and are accessed by corridors at every third level. And in the section that you see here, the corridors, there are 6 of them in all, are represented by yellow squares, but also by the green bar across the middle, which Corbusier intended should be a shopping street for the residents. But unfortunately, they didn't provide enough custom to make the shops viable. So now groceries are delivered to the door in a van, and the former shopping street has become a frugal hotel with an excellent restaurant. And staying there gives you the run of the building and allows you to share in the social life of the rooftop, which incorporates an art studio, a kindergarten, and a multitude of ad hoc activities. And if you ask nicely, you may be enrolled in the residence yoga class. Bevincourt is one of 6 landscaped estates that the London County Council commissioned from Berthold Lubetkin in the 1940s to replace houses destroyed in the war or condemned as slums. Lubetkin emigrated from Moscow in 1925, first to Berlin and Paris, and then to London. He shared the belief of de Klerk that workers who had been denied beauty all their lives deserved something better. And so, although the budget was tight, he spent money where it would show, on lively facades and fantastic staircases, encouraging residents to linger and chat. You wonder how many friendships have been made leaning over the balustrade of this extraordinary staircase that rivals the best of Borromini. On the outskirts of Madrid, Morphosis reinterpreted the North African Casbah as social housing. Carabanchel, as the project is known, is one of 27 innovative projects commissioned by the City Housing Authority, and it's intermixed with prosaic market rate blocks that were thrown up rapidly in a frenzy of speculation before the recession of 2008 caused the market to collapse. Slab blocks to the north and south bracket a tight-knit complex of 3- and 4-bedroom duplexes that open onto shady passages and patios, much as they would in a Casbah in Algeria, which is not that far south. Passive solar strategies mitigate the heat of summer. Boreal, in the French port city of Nantes, is a 5-story block of small apartments and duplexes that replaces a dysfunctional 1960s tar block. The local firm of Tetrarch fanned out 11 bays using rich tones to articulate them and provided, you can see on the left, a wood frame entry structure that doubles as a stack of terraces and is linked by walkways to each level of the apartment, not each level, of 2 levels of the apartments. At the front, each duplex has a fully glazed winter garden that can be opened up in summer or enclosed to provide a spacious addition to the living area. Copenhagen is a showcase of enlightened housing, especially on the newly developed island of Orestad. Tietgen, designed by Lundgaard and Trenberg, is a donut of student housing comprising 400 studio apartments on 5 levels. Each group of 8 shares a kitchen dining room around the perimeter, and the courtyard is a popular gathering place. A mile south is 8 House, named for its ground plan. The blocks slope down on one side to give most residents a sweeping view. It was designed by Bjarke Ingel of Big, who employed a similar strategy on Via 57 on the west side of Manhattan. 8 House incorporates retail and a primary school at ground level, offices on the 2nd level, and a mix of 500 apartments and townhouses above, all accessed by ramps that wind up around each courtyard and provide easy access for the handicapped, for mothers with strollers, for kids playing. It's a wonderful play area with just the right gradient so the kids don't roll away and into the sound. Finally, Interlace, Ole Sheeran's ambitious megastructure in Singapore. 31 prefabricated concrete blocks, each 6 stories high, are stacked as though in a cat's cradle to achieve a high density within a mandatory height limit. There's a lively mix of amenities and activities at ground level, and the shady courtyards, water features, and channel breezes lower the temperature in this hot, humid location. Los Angeles needs affordable housing that's as affordable and affordable housing that's as humane and imaginative as these projects, and in vastly larger quantities than anything we've achieved thus far. There are many obstacles: craven politicians, a sclerotic bureaucracy, a jungle of restrictions, and NIMBYism have combined to block progress. So it's incumbent on all of us who care about these things to work for change. And that's an appropriate point to pass over the baton to Raymond Neutra, who has presented these slides and will now talk about the work that his father did in this area.
So as Sion said, our mission is to preserve and use the Neutra legacy to promote evidence-inspired design that benefits people and the planet. So how are we using the Neutra's multi-household projects in Silver Lake to stimulate conversations about today's apartment design? My dad is known mostly for his residential projects, such as the Level Health House and the Kaufman Desert House. The Level Health House was really a house and a school, 1929. 1946 Kaufman Desert House. But the themes in the Neutra practice was to use individual residences as case studies for multi-household structures and to meld technology and nature. So starting in the 1920s and going all the way through the late 60s, apartments, more than 16 of them, were part of the practice. In the 20s, this was the idea of what an apartment house would look like. But my father had a different idea, exemplified with this project, the Jardinette, that he did with Rudolf Schindler. And then into the 1930s, in Westwood, a series of apartments, always with balconies and access to nature. A duplex in San Francisco, again with balconies. The Kelton triplex in the early 40s with balconies. And in the early 40s, even a community of 300 prefabricated units for airplane workers, also with balcony apartments. And around the same time in San Pedro for dock workers, balcony household structures, even with their own apartment, with their own furniture design. All of this was looked at as creeping socialism in the 50s, and then the Neutra practice did work with military housing, and finishing with this dormitory at the University of Pennsylvania in the late 60s. So my brother Dion has left 3 apartment-containing structures in the Silver Lake district of LA, the Reunion House apartment, the Neutra office apartments from which I'm speaking today, and the Treetop triplex. We plan to have QR codes whereby passersby with their smartphones can get a short video of an interior of the building talking about continuing design challenges that apartments have today that were grappled with back then. Another one will talk about the impact on the brain of architectural tactics. And the third one will provide a virtual reality walkthrough of one of the spaces. So even though these are occupied apartments, people will have an idea of what's going on inside. And there's similar opportunities for the Neutra VDL studio and residences down the block, and the Koblik duplex just a couple of blocks to the south. So this is what visitors will see, something like this. The Neutra Institute invites you to scan these QR codes to access 3 separate interior experiences of this building. Please do not disturb the occupants. So what do we mean by continuing design challenges? In this building, the 2 apartments in the back had, no, I'm mixing up. The Reunion House had the challenge of accommodating several different generations in the same space. This building here had the challenge of spaces that could either be used as a commercial space or a residential space. And in the Treetops, the issue of balcony design. What does it take to make a balcony usable rather than as a storage place for your bicycle? With regard to the neurological impact at the Reunion House, we're talking about how tactics made small spaces seem large. In the Neutra office apartments, we're talking about natural light and how it affects physiology and performance and health. And in the Treetops, we're talking about the impact of being able to get out into nature, even in an apartment. So the first of these buildings that we're responsible for now is a 1949 reunion house and apartment with this issue of multi-generations use and the issue of illusion of spaciousness. So Mr. Walter Johnson, whose grandparents lived in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, commissioned my father in 1949 to build him a spec house, and my father decided to make it a space where grandparents could entertain children and grandchildren, and it anticipated that there would be an ADU, which was ultimately built later. So grandma and grandpa were over here, and children and grandchildren were here who could exit on their own to go to Disneyland, and they were separated by this living room. So this is the part that the kitchen and dining nook for the visitors, this ample living room between as a buffer. And then in this space, the idea was not to have grandma and grandpa feel to be in a claustrophobic kind of space, such as they would if there was a conventional fenestration, but instead there was this approach with hovering overhangs, spider leg, and mitered glass window. And we talk a little bit about why does this seem so much larger. This kind of hovering overhang was something that was not typical of European architecture, and it may evoke the kind of feeling that we got for hundreds of thousands of years, sheltering under trees, looking at the horizon for cheetahs and mates. We hope to use this space for visiting scholars. Our first one was Professor Paul Chamberlain, who's an expert on aged housing, and he spent some time interacting with Professor at USC, whose interest is in that. The ADU that was built above the garage, designed by my brother, just a 500 square foot little apartment, and yet feels very spacious and private. Then in the 1950s, my father started a partnership with Robert Alexander and built a building with these spaces that could either be residential or commercial, and where he paid a lot of attention to natural light. So this is the Neutra office apartments where I'm talking today. Robert Alexander was the partner, and it has a large drafting room in the front that where I'm sitting now. And my brother Dion had used it as an art venue, and we're hoping to find a tenant that will do something for the public benefit along this line. In the back are these two spaces, and we have restored the upper one with its balcony, its sunshades, and we have prepared a 3-minute video about natural light and what it does to physiology and performance. The third legacy that we have is the 1982 Treetops by Dion Neutra, where we're talking about balcony design and the impact of balcony views and experience. And here is Dion in front of the building with its wonderful balconies, and that lead to that discussion. Now, there are two other household structures in the Silver Lake area that will be part of this Fort LA Trail. This is the place that I grew up, which was built in 1932. And it was designed to accommodate 3 households and an office, all on a 60 by 70 foot lot. And it was designed also to capture near and far views. It was an experiment. There was a 15-page coverage back in 1934 about this. It's prefabricated foundation, the use of awnings that could crank up or down to control the influx of heat and light, a rooftop garden looking out over the lake, And once again, this strategy of having hovering shelters to shelter you while you're enjoying these exterior views. One of the characteristics of the Neutra presentation back in the early 30s that is somewhat different from other architects at the time is it's always exposed to show what's going on outside. So as I was growing up, there were 3 households in an office. So this is where we lived. And here is the family. That's me, my father, Dion, my mother, and my Aunt Regula, who lived with us for 8 years in another wing of the house, all able to come and go with different exits to have their own independent life. And then here was an office. I should say that upstairs, let me go back here. Upstairs, it was another family, and that was Frank Wilkinson and his wife. Frank was the founder of public housing in Los Angeles before he fell afoul with the McCarthyite politicians of the time. And then there was the office that was there on the ground floor, and at the far end was a small apartment with its own kitchen where Gregory Ain and his first wife had lived. My favorite room in the house is this little tiny bedroom with its built-in furniture, a little bit like an Airstream trailer. Then finally, there's the 1937 Cobblick duplex, where 2 households hover on a cliff, capturing a long view. Here is Mr. and Mrs. Cobblick. He was an art professor at LA State, and he rented this upper unit, and one of them accessed on this side and the other accessed on the other. And this is the view that these apartments have over Silver Lake. As we mentioned, Fort LA is having a trail with a beautiful documentation of all part of the structures designed by Neutra, and another trail dedicated to the equally imaginative apartments of Rudolf Schindler. So once again, we've inherited these 3 apartments. We're trying to use this legacy to stimulate conversation through these QR codes and cooperating with these other buildings. Our educational goals for passersby is that they'll go away thinking that apartment design is as worthy as individual house design, that there are ongoing challenges to be addressed in these kinds of design, and that good apartment design is more than an amenity, it has important effects. And thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Larry Scarpa. That's supposed to be me there on the end, the multifamily residence of tomorrow, I suppose. But it's impossible to talk about the future without understanding the past. This is one of my favorite buildings. This is Horatio Court by Irving Gill in Santa Monica, built in 1919. You can imagine at that time, 1919, this happened to be a pretty dense project in the neighborhood, you know, close to the beach, but not a lot happening at that point. What's really interesting about this project is you look at, I think it looks better today, 100 years after it was built than when it was actually built. And I think in part because it's a building that's loved. And why it's loved is, I think, not necessarily the building itself, but the space that the building creates. And so that place in the middle was originally a driveway for cars, and cars would come through there and park in the back of the project. Again, going back to 1919, cars were, you know, probably more like wagons. And, you know, this really became a shared street. It's a idea that is really quite common and gaining popularity today. The street as a places for people, but where they can be shared with cars. But what's transformed is this building has turned into a courtyard building. And that courtyard has become really the lung for this building. Okay. The idea of courtyard is nothing new. It's existed for thousands of years, and you find them all over the world in many different configurations from Asia, Egypt, Europe, all over the place, and in a whole variety of uses. Right here in Southern California, it is a typology or model that is so prevalent, it's really part of the history of LA. The picture you see on the upper right is actually the apartment building where I lived in Venice when I first moved here. But they don't have to be fancy either. It's kind of the space that unites, the space between that unites the people that live there. And this is really critical for all multifamily housing to happen. Michael talked earlier about his neighbors being like family. That's what happens through the courtyard. So, and even looking at my own work, I see that I've done things subconsciously that maybe I didn't even think of doing it that way or that idea, but it's prevalent in what I do. This is a building we did for the Skid Row Housing Trust. This is the Rossmore Hotel. It's a project type that's illegal today in LA. It's 110 units. It's called the Rossmore Hotel, but it was always a residence. Like most of the buildings of that time, built in the turn of the century up until even the 1940s, were called hotels, but they were co-housing. And that's really important. Where today we're mired in regulations and ordinances that make this building illegal. In fact, for when we did the remodel, it took almost an act of Congress to get approved this use. So it's 110 units. To give you an idea what that means, it's 403 units per acre. The average density of Manhattan, New York City, is 252 units per acre. So if we're going to understand housing, you have to understand density. And if we're going to solve the housing crisis here in LA, we have to deal with the issues of density. And density is not a dirty word when dealt with appropriately. So this is what we were given. This was a modernization. Our client was, just it needs new doors and windows and handicapped accessibility, no design. But we had these two little tiny, you can see exterior spaces. This is a fire exit right here that you're looking at. That's what it looked like when we got it. And this is what it looks like now. So we transform this into the public place for the people in the building. The benches move, even the units on the ground. We created a screen that keeps them from being right on it, but we've also maintained that fire exit. The other area is a 6-foot by 60-foot space that look like what you see in the pictures on the left. It was basically used for trash at that point. And this is what it looks like today, where we made a pot for each resident and they would care for the plant, but it became a space for them to use, a modest space, but it's really becomes part more important in a way than the building itself. You can see here, this is a common kitchen. still very modest, but you can see how it connects to the courtyard. And I'm sorry, I'm not showing you the existing, but it's quite a dramatic change even in its modesty. So this is a model that we need approved again in LA. We need this to be part of it, but our rules are basically stymieing innovation and new models for housing. The project we completed not too long ago, this is also for Skid Row Housing Trust. It's their first building off of Skid Row. It's 52 units for disabled veterans. And it is also a courtyard building. This building is also north of 100 units per acre. So most of the projects that we're doing are 5 to 10 times the density of the surrounding properties in that neighborhood. But you know, courtyards too, and particularly with housing and people who suffer from schizophrenia and mental disabilities, there needs to be a sense of control and privacy. So we've kind of come up with this idea of having a secured courtyard that's often on the upper level, but we've kind of modified the edges so that they don't have what normally would be handrails or that you see, so that when you're on the courtyard, your views are straight out. And so while it is secured from the street, it's visually and highly connected to the street. So you can kind of see it of how that courtyard is open to the street. And, you know, we treat our courtyards like the lungs of our buildings. And in affordable housing too, you know, we work with the Marciano Foundation. This is original artwork, but the courtyard for us is part of the healing process. And we kind of treat it a bit like a dance floor, you know, where you don't have to be the person, the John Travolta in the middle of the dance floor. You could, if you want, you could be sitting by yourself watching TV or reading a book in the community room that opens up to it. So you have your own, you integrate at your own scale, you participate at your own pace, and you're not kind of forced to be with each other. But you can see here how the courtyard is really almost fuses with the street. This is one we just completed for Venice Community Housing, right across from Whole Foods. When I moved to Venice, this is very close to my house. You know, I tell people we had helicopters every night because I was in the middle of a gang war. We still have those same helicopters, except now they follow Lindsay Lohan to court. So, you know, people came out of the woodwork against this building. The term affordable housing is, you know, brings out the worst in people for some reason, but it is also a courtyard building like Horatio Court that's just 1.5 miles away. So it's like, I call it the poor man's hanging gardens of Babylon, you know, where it has similar ideas of the court, where it empties out, but the landscape that kind of surrounds it, and you have this kind of cascading deck that ties it all together. Community room opens to it, and so you get people that kind of hang out at their leisure, and this becomes part of the social space, again, as Michael talked about, that kind of brings people and bonds them together. It has, the nonprofit has their offices on the ground floor and the housing is above. But again, you can see that courtyard is arranged with the stepping and cascading of the planters so that it becomes part of the streetscape. And we made this little extension on the circulation. It's just a little cantilever pop out that gets, you know, person can go up there and have 270-degree views. They get views of the beach, the mountains. It's pretty dramatic living there. And we believe Because you live in affordable housing doesn't mean you can't have good design. They're not mutually exclusive. This notion, again, extends around the world. We're working right now in Miami Beach. This is called Normandy Isles. Just to give you context, this is an island where Jared Kushner lives and other, let's call them well-to-do people. And we're now doing a 150-unit affordable senior housing project here. We have 3 projects, of which I'm just going to show you one. But we were kind of inspired what's going there. You know, you look in Miami Beach, and this is what you see. You see these great courtyards with the landscaping. You don't have to invent anything. You really just find it. And for us, it's always how you reimagine it, how you look at the MIMO and the brise soleils that exist there. We kind of took this kit of parts and kind of created a place that is inspired by those while adapting to rising sea levels. So this is a building that embodies a lot of those historic notions, but it's raised and it's set to deal with climate change. The last thing I'm going to show you here is another project we just finished in North Hollywood by, the emerging NoHo district and arts district. And I think this is the model of the future. This is an inclusionary housing project. So it's market rate, but it has set aside for very low income tenants to be here. And it's proven that diverse communities are the most successful. So when you have upscale neighborhoods that have all these beautiful restaurants, you need people to work in them. And, no mortal person can usually afford these neighborhoods. So the inclusionary aspect allows working class people, firefighters, teachers, nurses, hotel industry, restaurants to be in places where they work, and it improves everything. And we could get in a very long discussion about why this is the right thing, but we'll save that for Q&A. But again, this is a courtyard building. It's I'm going to see how many different ways I can do courtyard buildings in my lifetime. There are many. But this one is really, as Mike Alvidrez from Skid Row Housing Trust would say, it's a box with a hole in it. But Joe Giovannini pointed out to me that, and I never thought about this, but it's a neighborhood of buildings within a building. And I like that. It's almost like a community where you've got the courtyard and the spaces that revolve around this. So we have retail on the ground, limited parking, and then you have housing, which revolves around a court, and the idea that you get this courtyard to kind of step down and become part of the streetscape, even though it has its own sense of pride. It's totally secured, but it's really open to the street. So I'm going to leave you with something that I like to say. As I say, it's not the beauty of the building that you create or you should look at. Rather, it's the beauty created by the buildings. And that's really what makes housing work. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for those presentations. They were quite excellent. So I thought I want to start off while we're waiting for some questions to come in. I thought one of the really interesting things that almost everybody touched on, especially Larry and Michael, was this idea of the courtyard. And I want to connect that back to Richard Neutra, because it was in doing a little reading this week, Thomas Hines mentions that RJN's design for the Strathmore apartments in particular was what he considered to be a modernist version of the stacked megastructures of the Southwest Pueblo Indians, sort of combined with the more recent bungalow courts that are endemic to Southern California, as Larry was showing this. And so Raymond, I guess the first question goes to you. Does what Thomas Hines said about Strathmore, does that resonate for you? Does it resonate for how you knew your father's work and philosophy relative to multi-unit projects?
You know, I worked in the Southwest, and those stacked communities, people entered in from the ceiling and climbed in ladders down and so forth. But there certainly was that communal aspect of it. So to that extent, I think there is, there's a relation, and my father, as did Schindler, admired those cubic structures and visited them.
Excellent, excellent. I'm curious if Larry, you or Michael, kind of saw that same element that Thomas Hines did. I mean, I'm not an architect, so is that, does that feel like a fair comparison to make about Neutra's work on Strathmore?
Michael, you take this.
Well, having lived there, climbing up and down those 64 steps from the street to my apartment every day has familiarized me with the character of the courtyard. The brilliant thing about the Strathmore apartments is that he stepped up a hillside rather than leveling the hill and putting in a block rising directly from the street, as everybody else has done, almost everybody has done since. He respected the topography. He adapted the idea of the bungalow court to a very steep slope. Every unit is set back, and therefore from the street, you're looking at a two-story building. You look up and you see buildings receding in back. But the beautiful thing about it is it doesn't overwhelm you as a building 50 foot high on the street would. So he's able brilliantly to accommodate more units without overwhelming the pedestrian. And I think this is true of so many of the projects that were, well, certainly of Larry's. The apartment buildings in LA that Larry was describing, I think I've explored all of them with him. And they are a brilliant response to the street. If you've been homeless, sleeping on the street, you don't want to be removed to some area in the sky. You want, in fact, to retain some degree of visual, emotional contact, perhaps, with the street that you just left and the people whom you were once living among. And all of his buildings do that. And at the same time, they're so much more imaginative, so much better designed than the so-called luxury housing blocks that proliferate in Santa Monica, along the Wilshire corridor and so on. So a long answer to a short question. It's in fact just the spirit of place and also the sense of creating a unique location.
So we have questions rolling in, and one of them is a good one that occurred to me as well. So, we've been talking about Southern California climate. Michael, you took us on around the world, frankly, to look at some other projects as well. But this idea of the courtyard, wondering how this can be reconciled, or does it have to be reconciled in less forgiving climates like those on the East Coast, which have harsh winters and that kind of thing. Have you done any work, Larry? And I mean, you mentioned Miami, which is somewhat similar, to the sunny climate of California. But any thoughts about how you might look at the same concept for a harsher climate?
Yeah, it's we have a project going in Detroit. While it's somewhat different, it's similar in concept. The idea of having the social space act as the lungs for the building still applies, but we get this all the time being in California. People always go, well, it works there, but it won't work here, as if California, you might as well be on Mars. Like I tell my New York friends, I've opened an office in Amsterdam, and they go, really? Do you have work there? I go, no, I'm trying to get some work in New York. So the ideas will transcend climate. They won't be the same solution, but we often look at trying to invent new models without looking right in front of our face. And what we try to do is really not invent, but find new ways of things which are right in front of our face. But we're often stymied, and it's getting worse and worse and worse with rules and regulations that stymie how we're able to do things. I've, along with Angie and other like-minded people, we've started 2 different nonprofits to deal with these kind of issues, because we get these quite ridiculous regulations. And so we have a policy part of our organizations that make policy change or attempt to make it. So these ridiculous things that we encounter, we fight them on the policy level and change them for everyone. To give you an idea, we wrote the small lot ordinance that, ask any architect in LA, they know the small lot ordinance. We wrote that and shepherded that through. It was, the language was changed and not perfect, but now the city is changing how they interpret those things too. I go in myself under that ordinance to get a permit, and they tell me that's not the intent of the ordinance. And I go, really? So we have to work to make change through, policy to make it happen.
Sian, can I just add one comment to what Larry just said? You don't have to live in a benign climate to appreciate courtyards or outdoor living. Berlin and Copenhagen both have the courtyard building as almost their signature model, even though they have frigid winters. But precisely because of that, they value when the sun does come up, when the temperature does rise above freezing. Berliners and Copenhagen all out there on their bicycles, sitting at sidewalk cafes, enjoying the fact that it's no longer polar bear weather. So in fact, the courtyard or the outdoor terrace is universally appreciated. And by the way, in Miami, it is much too sticky and humid for much of the year to enjoy, at least for me, to enjoy sitting outside. So I'd say Berlin would be a better bet.
Okay, fair enough. So we had another thoughtful question, and it relates back to what Raymond was talking about in terms of, multi-generational housing. Larry, you talked about creating senior housing, and yet at the same time, you also talked about, that diverse communities in these kinds of projects, are the most successful communities. And the question was talking about how do you basically respect the boundaries of between families and yet within the family unit. So I don't know if you can speak to that, or any of your projects, purposely trying to integrate different generations. Maybe Michael also knows about whether that's happening in the Copenhagen properties or some of the European properties as well.
It's more prevalent in Europe, but we're learning. We have the Rose Avenue property I just showed you is called Tay housing. It's for transitional age youth. So when kids who are in foster care or, don't have parents, they live in housing, when they turn 18, they're basically termed out and they put them on the street, and that's where the problems begin. So this project is for those kids that term out of foster care and they have a place to go. But Venice Community Housing they're smart. They're smart enough to know you just don't put a bunch of kids, in a building. So they have adults, they have other things that become part of their community, to help them reintegrate and be better. It's always a little weird to me. The biggest developer in this country, Related, everyone thinks of them as doing, $100 million penthouses in New York, and they started out in affordable housing. And many of those buildings that have those $100 million condos also have affordable housing in them, so you can't really tell the difference. There's, this kind of stigma we have is that, you know, affordable housing is for people that have needles stuck in their arm, you know, coming off the street. And that's not who the people are. They're like you know, that's the 1% or less than 1%. Most of them are like you and I who've just been down on their luck.
Yeah. So a follow-up question to that, which was directed at you anyway, and it makes perfect sense to share it now. It says, Larry, what have you found is the best approach to convey to a community where an affordable housing project is planned so as to win over their support versus there being antagonistic? Is it, you know, I would also add to that, what do you say to a developer to convince them that design is an important component? You know, those two stakeholder groups are very different.
Ironically, design has become the neutralizer in a lot of ways. So there are people who are going to be against affordable housing project no matter what. There are going to be people for it no matter what. That's a very small percentage. Those people we generally ignore. It's the vast majority in the middle who listen and are not closed-minded. So when they see one of our projects, they go, you know, this is great. We're going to get this in our neighborhood. It becomes, in a certain sense, the neutralizer. So many of the nonprofits, you know, now or hire myself, Lorcan, Michael Maltson, there are others, and the design has been elevated because it's become a path of least resistance to, you know, get their projects done. It's honestly shouldn't be that way. It should be, you know, we need to be able to do them without having some, you know, secret sauce to get it built. But design does matter, and it has made a difference. It wasn't always that way, and you know, we were doing this when it wasn't very popular, you know, and people were going, oh, other designers, affordable housing, you know, that's like, who wants to do that? You know, not very sexy.
Indeed. So Raymond, I'm wondering if you could say a few words. You didn't talk about Chavez Ravine in your father's work, but I wondered if you could just make a couple of comments about that project. Maybe share just a little bit about it for the, you know, few people who might be on the call who are not familiar with what it was and why it didn't happen.
In near Elysian Park, in the area that is now the Dodgers Stadium, there were three Hispanic communities. Many of the people owned their own homes. Some of them were a little run down, but they were intact communities. And the idea was that that space would be used to provide low-rise and high-rise apartments, affordable housing with community centers and so forth. And Neutra and Alexander got that commission. There was concern that the number of units that were proposed were maybe exceeded what really was feasible, and yet that was the commission. Catherine Bauer and others warned Neutra and Alexander that this could be problematic. But that being said, it also ran into the McCarthy era, and the project manager was Frank Wilkinson, who was asked in a hearing by a hostile set of city politicians whether he was a member of the Communist Party, and he took the fifth and was fired, and that did end that project, which in the land lay unused for a while, and then to attract the Dodgers to Los Angeles, that land was devoted to the Dodger Stadium after those communities had been raised.
So Angie, my partner, had done a study. We have 77,000 homeless people in LA. All of those people would fit if you could solve the homeless problem because they would all fit on Dodger Stadium and Santa Monica Airport.
Hmm.
The whole 77,000 people would fit in that much space.
That's fascinating. That is
But
really
Larry, you
fascinating.
wouldn't advocate concentrating them all together like that, I suppose.
No, I would advocate for a more mixed model. I also, I'm a big supporter of affordable housing, but I also don't believe in 100% affordable housing projects.
Mhm.
It's necessary, but I think nonprofits should be forced to include market rate housing too. Maybe 10%, and market rate projects should be forced to have affordable housing. Affordable housing was never by history for homelessness. It was for working class people. That's what affordable housing was. It was not for down and out desperate people. It was for normal people who couldn't afford housing.
But,
Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry. Can I just interject one thing, that homelessness and the absence of affordable housing, it seems to me, are interwoven, because if you can't afford a house, you become homeless. And from what I've heard, many middle-class people who've had, an expensive divorce, lost their job, had a major medical crisis, become homeless because they can no longer afford to keep up the mortgage or the rent. So if you provide sufficient affordable housing, you are in fact going to certainly curb the growth of homelessness. And I agree totally with Larry that you don't want to ghettoize. Westwood has become a student ghetto, which is not good for the students or for the grown-ups who share space with them. It would be far better if there were a mixture of ages in that apartment building across the street. It would be far better if, when a major development is done, it's not just bribing the developers to provide 2 or 3 affordable apartments, but 30%. And if the equation, if it doesn't pencil out in money terms, then there has to be a subsidy, just as there is when you're building public housing, or when you used to build public housing. And we've lost sight of that. And I think one of the problems is that there is still a McCarthy-ish spirit, one might even say a revival of McCarthyism in the present climate, where anything collective or done for people of modest means is regarded as creeping socialism. And it's not penalized to quite the same degree as when people were blacklisted or fired for their political beliefs, but it's a huge deterrent. And I think what is so extraordinary about what Larry and Michael Maltson and Lorcan and others have done is to combat that feeling that somehow it's not American enough to have this mixture, this kind of collective structure. I think, as Larry said, good design has made the whole thing more palatable to all but the really bigoted.
Got it. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there for today, but thank you so much to all of the presenters today. It's been a fascinating juxtaposition. We didn't even really get to the topic of density, because I think that was another one of the words that came up in almost everybody's presentations today. But thank you for starting this dialogue. We hope to continue it at the Institute through our properties and through other programs in the future. And even maybe some in-person programming. Wouldn't that be a lot of fun to do? To actually see one another and talk to one another in person. So again, thank you to Raymond, thank you, Michael, thank you to Larry Scarpa, and I want to thank all of the folks who joined us today. If you missed any part of this program, I wanted to let you know that we are recording it, and we will be able to put out a link to that. So if you missed the beginning or one of the presentations or want to see it again, we're going to make that happen for all of you. So thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday and have a wonderful week. We hope to see you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.